Now that we have created our first div, we can explore CSS declaration that allow us to customize the look and positioning of our div. The first item of discussion is CSS ID. CSS IDs are similar to classes. They are defined in your style sheet and referenced in your HTML element. The primary difference is that once an ID has been referenced in an HTML element, it cannot be used again within the same HTML file. You might recall that when we create classes, we would use that class as many times as we needed for multiple HTML elements. This is not a case of IDs. IDs are generally used for layout elements that will only be needed once. A great place to use ID is for defining CSS rules for divs. Divs are considered layout elements because they contain content such as graphics, text, and media that make our web pages. Each div requires its own unique set of attributes. One example is the position attribute. In most cases, when designing CSS layouts, you wouldn't have two divs in the same location on the web page. For this reason, we would need two IDs that define unique position attribute for each div. Let's create a style rule for our div before applying it to the div we created earlier. In order to create a style rule for our div and reference it as an ID, we need to declare it in style sheet. Let's create our style tag and define the ID. We will call this ID div1. And when defining an ID, you need to place the number sign in front of the name. This particular ID now contains 4 style definitions. The div will be 80% of width of our content area. It will have 3 pixel black border. The background of the div will be yellow and any text content the div will be the blue. And we will also mention again that the style rule for our ID reference begins with a number sign. Unlike our classes which began with a period, with our ID created, we can now reference this ID in our devoted. We will go ahead and apply the ID here. We need to reference the ID by name, and since we name it div1. Now let's go ahead and save our file and preview it in our web browser. See the final result. So here we can see we have a 3 pixel black border. The background of the div is yellow. Text content within the div is blue and the div is 80% of the width of full content area. In addition to referencing an ID in our div tag, we can also create a class and apply it to the div as well. Let's say we want in all the text in our div to be underlined. Well, first we need to create the class. So remember that your class starts off with a period followed by the class name. And this is the CSS syntax for underlined text. Next, we'll apply this class in our div tag. So just make a space type class equals to put the name of class underline. Now we can save our file and preview it again. And now we can see that class has been applied. All the text within our div tag is underlined.